Hello class, welcome to week 3 of U.S. History to 1877. Dr. D'Amico here again. So happy you're still with us. So week 3 is about the American Revolution, interpretations of the American Revolution, some of the legacies of the American Revolution. That's what we'll be getting into. Let's see. This PowerPoint, before we get into the revolution itself, I will briefly look ahead to week 3, what's due this week. I'm going to remind you that you should be handing in Essay 1 fairly shortly. And then it's time to start thinking ahead to Essay 2. So we'll do that. Then I'm going to talk to you a little more about the week 3 assignments, then the revolution. So we're in week 3 right now. Your week 3 assignments are very similar to weeks 1 and 2. There's no discussion board in week 3, and that's because your Essay 1 is due. Besides that though, week 3 you have a reading outline assignment, you have a journal assignment, no discussion board. However, do not forget, you really need to hand in Essay 1, and that is due this week. That's worth a fair amount of points, so make sure to get that in. Looking ahead to Essay 2, I know already time to start thinking about that next one, but if you look at the Essay 2 assignment, you'll see that it's about primary sources, using primary sources and comparing and contrasting them to secondary sources as a way of studying the past. So the journal assignments for this week and next week are designed to help you with Essay 2. Before you even get to that though, I just wanted to show you this PowerPoint slide, which was on the week 2 PowerPoint. And this is some helpful reminders that I think should help you with Essay 1. If you need a little help, don't be afraid to take a look at this slide. Never be afraid to contact me. You can message me, you can email me. So go ahead and contact me if you have questions, concerns. Do not hesitate. Okay, so your week 3 assignments in depth. You have your reading outline 3 due this week. What that is going to encompass is an article about historiography by Michael Hatton. This is a picture from that article. I'll just remind you again here that historiography is the study of how historians have interpreted the past. I think the article explains it all really well. So you'll read the article, you'll answer the questions about it in Reading Outline 3. Then you're going to read Zen Chapter 4 and 5. For the Journal 3, that's all about Ona Judge, who was actually a slave who belonged to Martha Washington, George Washington's wife, and she ended up escaping. So you're going to read a little introductory information about her. You're going to read a couple of primary sources, which are interviews with Ona Judge. And if you want to, I put a link up to a really interesting drunk history video that's about Ona Judge, but you do not have to watch the video, only if you want to, because there is drunkenness and cursing in the video. So feel free to watch it or not, whichever you choose. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the American Revolution. There's sort of 3 facets I'll be talking about. First is interpretation of the revolution, and that is going to relate to your Reading Outline 3. I'm going to just briefly give you a little timeline of what happened with the American Revolution to sort of hang your hats on as you proceed with week 3. And then we'll talk a little bit about the legacies of the American Revolution, and that will help you with your Journal 3 assignment. So we call the Revolutionary Era the time period all the way from, I'm going to say, from the 1750s till about 1800. That is not the time of the Revolutionary War. The actual war was a shorter time period, as I'll get to in a minute. But you could sort of say this whole time period from the 1750s till about 1800 is the American Revolutionary Era. First off, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about interpretation of the American Revolution. I think that interpreting something like the American Revolution is like peeling an onion. There's all these layers to it that have been built up over time in our sort of collective historical memory. And some of what we need to do as historians is peel back those layers. So just to remind you, we've talked about this already a lot in week 1. We talked about history and how we remember history. And specifically, we did that with a lot about Christopher Columbus. In week 2, you were introduced to the concept of American exceptionalism. That's the title of John Wilsey's book, and your journal too is a lot about that. And the idea of historiography, this idea that historiography is the study of how historians have studied history over time, and to primary sources, which are documents from the past. So that's just a little reminder of what we did in week 1 and 2. And here's the same sort of information that I just said. So American exceptionalism, historiography, and primary sources. If you need to, feel free to pause this recording and take a little more of an in-depth look at this slide to remind yourself. But I'm going to move on to interpretation and week 3 readings. So the reading outline 3, the first reading you have assigned for that is an article all about the historiography of the American Revolution. And I just want to, I've said something like this to you before, but I just want to reiterate to you that history really is interpretation. All we have from the past are some documents and some artifacts that happen to survive. And each generation really retells its own history to itself. Each generation retells history to itself. So how we interpret influences how we think about the world, and how we think about the world influences how we interpret the past. Because at the end of the day, really we are these stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, both at the individual level and at the collective level. A collective level meaning, for example, at the national level. A lot of people have used and continue to use the revolution as a weapon to prove that they're right about this political issue and everybody else is wrong. That happens all the time in politics, even today, or even in sort of not necessarily in politics, but people say stuff like, what would the founding fathers have to say about this? And actually, it's, that question's really hard to answer because the founding fathers lived a really long time ago in a different world. And actually, as we will be talking about a little more later, they often disagreed amongst themselves about things. Okay, I'm going to move on now to talk about what actually happened in the American Revolution. This is going to be brief, just to sort of give you a little bit of a timeline to hang your hat on. So to remind you, this is our entire class. We are in the revolutionary / early national period right now, really the revolutionary period. So we're finished with the colonial era. We're in the antebellum time period, which is the period before the Civil War, but specifically we're looking at the time of the American Revolution. As a reminder, when we talked about the colonial era, we talked a lot about what happened, and one of the sort of things that happened later in the colonial era was that the colonies actually became more and more economically connected with the mother country. Then, as that happened, as the 1700s went on, there was this real global war, which in the Americas was called the French and Indian War, but globally was called the 7 Years' War. And that war sort of helped lead to the American Revolution. So I'll talk a little more about that in a minute, but first I'll just remind you that in the colonial era, the colonies really existed, all the colonies, but we'll just talk about North America. The colonies really existed for the benefit of the mother country. They were supposed to turn a profit, and really the way to do that was massive exploitation of the land and of the people in order to just provide raw materials for the mother country. It's really this exploitation that's ultimately going to lead to the American Revolution, and by the way, to similar, not quite the same, but similar revolutions really throughout the world, especially in Latin America, right around the same time as the American Revolution. So anyway, this is a picture of the Boston Tea Party, some of the colonists in Boston sort of expressing their dissatisfaction with colonial administration by just throwing a bunch of tea into Boston Harbor. Okay, so the colonists sort of felt in a lot of ways really exploited by British colonial administration of the colonies. So here's a slide that talks a little bit about some of the buildup to the American Revolution. The French and Indian War was that global war I mentioned earlier, also called the 7 Years' War, that in a lot of ways actually really benefited England, and it really benefited the English colonies, because England won that war. But the thing is, it was really, really expensive. So what happened was there was this time period when the Parliament was really trying to actually get its money back that it had spent on this war, which is sort of all of these acts, etc., that you've probably heard about, that Zen talks a little bit about in chapter 4. All of these were attempts on the part of Parliament to recoup their losses. However, the colonists grew increasingly dissatisfied, not just with the fact that England was raising taxes, but with how they were doing it. The colonists felt that they were not sufficiently represented in Parliament. So, long story short, that's the build-up to the American Revolution. The actual fighting took place from 1775 to 1782. And so I think it's important to remember that the fighting actually started before the colonies declared their independence. It's important to keep in mind that the U.S. probably would not have won the revolution without the assistance of France. And then the fighting stopped in 1782. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, and the United States obviously won the American Revolution, became independent. In some ways, the real work really began after that, because it's actually not that easy to, first of all, set up, and secondly, administer a republic. So the Articles of Confederation were the first governing document of the United States. That proved somewhat difficult. See what Zen says about Shays' Rebellion. And that's then when we see the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Look at this slide here. As I said, I really think it explains so much about American history if we keep in mind that the Constitution itself was a series of compromises. Two of the important ones were the one that established the fact that we have a bicameral legislature with an upper house and a lower house, 2 senators per state, but the number of people in the representatives in the lower house, the House of Representatives, depends on the population of that state. And then perhaps even more importantly, the 3/5 compromise, which said that slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of counting the population of each state. This is important to keep in mind because it reminds us that not only was slavery legal, it was actually written into the Constitution. And of course, the big question about that, I think, and the question that would plague Americans until and probably after the Civil War is, how can liberty and slavery coexist? How can you have both at the same time? It actually doesn't make any sense. So that's sort of a lot of what we'll be talking about in the rest of our class. So moving on to legacies, that leads us right into your Journal 3 assignment, which is all about George Washington, Martha Washington, and this slave who escaped, Ona Judge, and sort of what does that mean about the United States of America, that probably one of our sort of highest founding fathers, George Washington, himself was a slave owner and owned a lot of slaves. So hopefully that will also help you think about the Essay 2 question of the relationship between primary and secondary sources as we study the past.